here with most of our attendees, I believe.
You might want to just do that again because we didn't hear you. Sorry about that.
It's not on there? Okay, start all over again. Okay, technical difficulties. All right. Good morning and welcome to our introductory session on the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework. Thanks for joining in, those of you who are members of our remote audience and to folks here at Science Hall. We're being hosted here by the Department of Geography and the Wisconsin Extension Service. So my thanks to those folks for setting this up. We're going to take about an hour and 45 minutes or so here to introduce the ACPF and some of its capabilities for the general audience here, and then we'll be moving into a two-day training session about 11 o'clock or so. But those of you who are online and those of you who are here should be able to, I'll be able to stay and answer questions while David and Sarah take you up and get you started on the first of the training exercises. So let's see. So the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework there's actually three pieces to it. There's a planning concept, there's a database behind it, and then it's ArcGIS toolbox as well. I thought I'd actually start by giving you a brief history of the project. It goes back about 4 or 5 years now. We undertook this as part of a conservation innovation grant funded by NRCS, and that grant was awarded to the Environmental Defense Fund in 2011. And our part in that project was to come up with GIS tools to identify appropriate places for conservation practices on the landscape. And as we went through that process, we kind of found just having a list of practices wasn't quite sufficient, that we needed a kind of an underlying concept behind that. And so that's kind of how the ACPF kind of coalesced then into its three parts, if you will. We did really, I mean, the availability of the data is what allows the ACPF to work. And the initial database covering it for land use and soils, covering down to the field level, the states of Illinois, Iowa, and southern Minnesota, was undertaken as a separate project beginning in 2011. We published a concept paper on this in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation in 2013. And then we held our first training workshop in Ames in 2014. We've had 3 training sessions since then in Ames and Mankato, Minnesota. So this is our 5th training session, and we're happy to be able to come over to Wisconsin to introduce folks over here to this project and the ACPF as well. We had 2 papers that described the ACPF in detail, the development of some of the tools, and testing and planning scenarios, and evaluation of the riparian assessment framework that we've come up with as part of the ACPF. That was published in mid-2015. So all the papers that have been published on this are freely available, and the links to those papers will be given at the end of my remarks here. We released the ACPF Toolbox version 1 and the user's manual last October. And there's the website. The North Central Region Water Network is hosting the site to make the data and toolbox and user's manual available online. We're grateful to the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They've stepped up since the original Conservation Innovation Grant went through its timeline, and the NRCS is providing additional support now that is allowing us to expand the database in terms of the area. We're going to be going up into the Red River Valley, covering all the agricultural area of Minnesota, and also being able to go over to the Western Erie Basin at the same time. We're developing new practices with this, and then also developing some training materials so that the three of us don't always have to be introducing this to new folks. We'd like to be able to have folks be able to pick this up and undertake some training without scheduling 2 or 3 days out of their schedule to come work with us. So, okay. Okay, what is the ACPF and what does it do? Well, it has a unifying concept. It's kind of underpinned by this concept for water quality improvement and management, and that's expressed through a conservation pyramid. It's quite a simple concept. I'll be showing you that here in just a couple of slides. It provides a broad base of detailed input data, so it's down to the field scale, but it's at a very broad extent, and so that allows us to conduct analyses, similar analyses down to the field scale across a very broad area. So we can take a uniform approach now across several states for watershed approaches to conservation planning. We've got a ArcGIS toolbox. It looks at a range of conservation practices and identifies locations on the landscape on a watershed basis that are appropriate for those types of practices. And what we're actually trying to do with this is facilitate greater landowner involvement in the planning process, because we're actually providing a full range of options for conservation practice placements down to the farm and field scale. Even though it's a watershed base, you can actually do field scale planning or begin to do field scale planning with the ACPF. And so we're looking at this as a the HUC 12 is our basic unit of analysis, but we have had some users who've taken this up to coarser resolutions and larger basins involved at the same time. Okay. So I'll talk about the input data a little bit. When I'm finished here, Dave's going to go into much more detail about this. We've got the soils and land use information, again, available down to the field scale for Illinois, Iowa, southern Minnesota, and eastern Kansas. And we are expanding the area out, and I'll show you that in just a second here. One thing we do not provide is the terrain data, the digital elevation models that the tools rely on, and those need to be acquired by the user, and then that terrain data needs to be hydro-enforced. That allows flow paths to be established then from anywhere in the watershed to the outlet. And that's important to be able to do to be able to evaluate the placement of certain practices and the amount of land area that might contribute water to practices wherever they get placed on the landscape. Okay. And so we've got tools to assist with that hydro enforcement. And so one of the things we'll be doing, and those of you who are here, get ready for a couple of hours looking at this technology for hydro enforcement of the detailed elevation data. Okay, and so our intent with this, in terms of the users, we'd like to have folks who have a modest background in GIS with a couple of days of training and knowledge of a particular watershed to be able to begin with the analysis and contribute to planning through that analysis. We've got a lot of options built into the tools, and this allows the output to be customized depending on the landscape and also landowner preferences. And so the idea is to be able to enable you to take this information out to your watershed community, get feedback about it, and even be able to adjust the output and come up with planning maps perhaps that are consistent in the way that placement and practice placements developed, but also responsive to landowners and local knowledge. Okay, so here's the area that we're going to, the hatched area there, Illinois, Iowa, southern Minnesota. Those data are available now. That area in eastern Kansas will be online in October. And the other areas are planned for development and release of that input data within the next year or so. This work's being done through an agreement with Iowa State University. They have several students working on this for as many hours as they can spare, as long as their eyes can endure the work of looking at field scale information, editing field boundaries, and tying everything together to the Huck 12 scale. So if we've got this detailed information available across this wide area, we're going to kind of take you to the concept part of this now. That was the introduction. We have this detailed information available. What are kind of our guiding principles, or kind of underlying basis for our approach here? And really, there's four ideas that we want to bring forward here. And first, each watershed is unique. I think we all recognize this. There's no two watersheds that are alike. The other piece that's really important is to be able to include landowners and farmers as partners in the planning process. We need to be able to do that. The third piece is that we know that there's not going to be a silver bullet out there. We're going to need a mix of practices. We need practices applied within fields and down below fields, right to the riparian zone, to be able to meet our water quality goals. And then finally, one of the critical pieces is soil management. So encourage all people who work with this to think of themselves, if you're doing watershed management, to consider the soil resource and the importance of maintaining the quality and improving the health of soils. And this can help stabilize the productivity of those soil resource for agriculture into the future.
Okay.
And but it also provides other ecosystem functions. And probably the most important of those for watershed management, of course, is the hydrologic function of the soils: water holding capacity, infiltration rates. Soil health is dependent on organic matter and maintaining the organic matter resource. If you've got a healthy soil with active biology, a lot of organic matter in there, you've got high infiltration rates, high water storage, and that means you're going to have less runoff and percolation of water through that root zone. And then that means that water that moves off of a field, there's going to be less of it, it's going to be moving off more slowly. And so those practices, those critical practices that we put in to intercept those flows, they're going to be, easier to manage and maintain because they're not going to be overrun as often. And so thinking about this, we've come up with this idea of the conservation pyramid, with the importance of maintaining and improving soil health as the base of the pyramid. So within the ACPF, we don't do any prioritization, spatial prioritization of soil management practices, because we think it's really important for producers to be able to, to be encouraged to maintain and improve their soils no matter where they are in a watershed. But if you think about then the way water moves across the landscape and the sorts of practices that we place out on the landscape to intercept and manage those flows, there are particular landscape settings that are most appropriate for those practices. And so the ACPF toolbox then is focused on those sorts of practices that control water within fields, below fields, and then riparian management as well. And so how do we, to take this kind of concept. And I've got this, this arrow here on the side, looking at that treatment train. And so you can think about water quality improvement as, in a watershed, as developing a set of opportunities along each flow path moving through a watershed to intercept and improve water quality. And so the more opportunities you've got to slow water down, filter out sediment and nutrients, the better that end result's going to be at the watershed outlet. And so one of the things we're encouraging here is to think about sequences of practices, stacking of practices, and being able to distribute that stacking of practices to the throughout the watershed to the extent that that's possible. And so then to take this concept and think about developing a toolbox, is we've developed this framework then, and it's kind of an organizing way of looking at the different tools that are part of the ACPF. And so you see this color sequence here. If you just flip that upside down, you can see the base of the pyramid up at the top there. No spatial prioritization, as I mentioned. But then if you think about other types of practices that intercept and control water flows, there's particular opportunities to do that in the watershed. And the toolbox then is very much aimed at those other practices that control water in fields, below fields, and then down into the riparian zone. So practices are placed at one of these three scales. That's kind of the concept we've got here. Conservation practices are also designed to intercept particular flow paths. And in the Midwest, we're usually talking about surface runoff and tile drainage. And so this forms this 3x2 matrix. And the practices that we cite within the ACPF can be kind of dropped into any of these kind of cells within this 3x2 matrix. And so the idea here is to think about practices that control tile drainage. And here's several of them listed here. What sorts of landscape attributes do we need to, how do we qualify sites to cite these different practices? Okay, for tile drainage, and then for runoff, there's a few of those types of practices. What landscape attributes do we need to be able to cite those? How do we identify those and consistently through a GIS system? And then also thinking about riparian functions. So when we look at riparian management in the ACPF, we're really considering three ways that contaminants get into a stream. One's by bank erosion, and you've also got overland flows carrying sediment and phosphorus, and then subsurface flows. And generally, you're looking at nitrates there. And so what types of vegetation do you need? How wide a riparian zone do you need to manage those? But then also, if you look at a specific length of stream in the riparian zone and the riparian zones, what are the attributes that you can look at in terms of slopes and elevations above that channel that help you identify what those opportunities might be to intercept those flows? And so that's one of the things that we'll be working through with you folks here in the room, and we'll be getting to this tomorrow afternoon, actually. Okay. And so I'm going to take you through an example application here. This is a watershed that we're very familiar with, the South Fork of the Iowa River in north central Iowa. We've been working this watershed about 15 years now. Just a representation here of the input data. It's recent glacial terrain, a lot of potholes, but the terminal moraine of the Des Moines lobe actually cuts through the watershed down through here, and so you've got these well-developed stream networks at the lower end of the watershed, but a kind of a glacial plain with a lot of internally drained potholes and ditch systems up in the upper part of the watershed. You see the representation of the the fields there. It's an intensively farmed watershed. There's a lot of livestock production there as well. And then just the soils information. And this essentially originally was a marsh complex, if you will. A lot of really wet materials or wet landscapes, very hard to cross when it was originally settled back around the 1840s and 50s. Okay. And so I'm going to step through this matrix then and show you a couple of examples of the practices that we cite with the ACPF and how they're kind of distributed here on this landscape. And so that's about a 200,000 acre watershed. It's 8 Huck 12s in total. So it also gives you an example of how you can kind of do this analysis in a bulked way, combining several watersheds together. The tools are very stable and seem to work for a variety of watershed sizes. Just depends on how long you're willing to wait for the tools to complete. All right. So, okay. And so the first cell that we're going to look at here is practices that can that help control tile drainage at the field scale. And two of them here, controlled drainage. This essentially is water table management. You need a very flat landscape to be able to implement this particular practice. And then also with all the depressions we've got on this landscape, a lot of these areas just stay really wet in the spring. They're difficult to farm. What are the alternatives, beyond those orange risers that just take that runoff and put it right into the tile drainage system? There's a variety of different practices you could put in there. The blind inlets are one. You could put in grass buffers or even wetland conversions. And so we've got ways of mapping these out and prioritizing the placement of those practices among a whole cadre of these depressional sites, if you will, that you can find in watersheds like this. Okay, and so just some examples here, looking at these depressions. So this is the uppermost Huck 12 in the South Fork. There's a lot of depressions here, and we've classified these according to depth of that depression, and we also map out the overland flow areas that that contribute overland flow into these depressions. And so in this particular Huck 12, more than 80% of the land area, runoff from that area would flow into a depression before it would flow into the stream. So if you were to fully buffer the stream coming through this watershed, you'd only be filtering about 20% of the runoff, according to this analysis. And so being able to map these out in terms of, what are the largest depressions and those that collect the most runoff, so those would be prioritized probably for these sort of treatments in this landscape. Okay, and then drainage water management. So this is the installation of a gate in a pattern tile drainage system at the edge of the field. It controls the water table elevation across the field. You need a very flat landscape. And so what we do with this is allow you to pick a contour interval between, I believe it's 30 centimeters and about 1.2 meters. This is a whole family of practices, the very flattest landscapes. You might be able to put in a single gate to control the water table elevation throughout that field. But as you increase, the variability of those elevations, you might need multiple gates, and the engineering of these becomes a bit more complicated. And so here's a map showing the flattest fields in this watershed. These fields, 40% of the field at least is within a 1 meter contour interval. So you could, be able to control that water table elevation with 2 gates across at least 40% of each of these fields. So this does not actually reduce nitrate. What it does is reduce drainage volumes, and so the loads that come off of nitrate are reduced by reducing the flow volumes on a seasonal basis. Okay, then looking at surface runoff. And one of the things we do with this is help the user prioritize those fields in a watershed that are most prone to deliver runoff directly to the stream. And we do that. It's a simple two-way classification, mapping out the proximity to the stream and the slope steepness of each field. And so those fields that are closest to the stream and steepest would be prioritized for runoff control practices. It doesn't mean to say that other fields that are also steep shouldn't have those practices installed. It's just a way of looking at it from the standpoint of which fields should be treated with these practices to observe a response at the watershed outlet. Okay. And so here's an example of the output for the South Fork. I mentioned that the steepest and most divided part of the landscape is in the lower section, with the terminal moraine coming right through here. So we've got most of the steeper fields in this watershed are in the lower part. Okay. And it's obviously picking up the fields that are closest to that stream network. And then a couple of those practices that we might place on this landscape, maybe focusing on those particular fields that are steep and near the stream, would be contour filter strips, and then grass waterways. And so we have tools for each of those. And so here's a placement of grass waterways among those fields, and then contour filter strips. Okay. And this is based on this tool will actually vary the distance between the contour strips based on the slope steepness, following NRCS technical guidance on that. Okay. I'm going to shift down now then to look at practices placed at field edges and below fields. And there's several practices that we have out there that are installed using impoundments. And the first one I've got is for water and sediment control basins. And essentially this is a terrace built across a waterway. There'd be an inlet on the upper side of it, and it's essentially a runoff detention basin for temporary storage of runoff. And so you can see we can place several of these along waterways in different parts of this watershed. And again, focusing here on those steeper fields closest to the stream. Nutrient wetlands, nutrient reduction wetlands are another practice that depend on impoundments. This is at a larger scale, so we're usually moving down into areas that have several hundred acres of drainage. And so we move up along drainage ways and test them. It's a very low impoundment, if you will. Okay. And what we want to be able to do is establish a wetland pool here. It's about 1 to 2% of that drainage area that contributes tile drainage into the system, but does not interfere with tile drainage coming from these areas up here. And so here's, this is a CREP wetland. The criteria we use to cite these are based on the Iowa Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. We don't follow them exactly, those criteria exactly, but we, kind of open up the range of settings where we might put these beyond what the CREP program has. But that's kind of the concept behind it. Okay, and so here's the idea here. Put in the impoundment in the lower part of the watershed. It doesn't interfere with drainage systems in the upper part of the watershed. And so you can get, depending on the area of this wetland relative to the contributing area, you can get 40 to up to 80% nitrate removal, depending on the load coming through there. Varies from year to year. And then looking at the South Fork of the Iowa River, then these are the areas that could be serviced using a nutrient removal wetland that meets those criteria. See, we probably a little bit more than a third of this watershed could be serviced with nutrient reduction wetlands. Okay, and then we move down to the riparian zone. Okay, the riparian assessment we have, in order to look at opportunities to intercept different sources of contaminants entering the stream, we again do a two-way classification, looking at how wide, well, first of all, how much runoff, or what the area of runoff delivery is into a particular riparian zone, and then we map out the low-lying area, that area that's within 1.5 meters or 5 feet elevation of the channel. And so those are areas that would have a high water table that you could actually moderate that with the roots of vegetation. And so that's an opportunity then to reduce nitrate along to those, if that's wide enough. And so to run this classification, okay, so here's a watershed in Illinois, Lime Creek. The blue shows the streams. The black lines show the runoff flow pathways. The longer these pathways, the longer the pathway, the greater the area of runoff contribution. And then we map out those low-lying areas adjacent to the stream, and we so we can look at how wide those zones are. We then discretize that stream network using a set of riparian assessment polygons, we call them. And then we run that two-way classification with the low-lying area versus amount of contributing area coming in. And then these classifications then convert to suggested widths of riparian vegetation and general types of vegetation that might best be suited to reduce the nutrients coming along that dominant opportunity for interception. Okay, and so the results for this South Fork are shown here. You see these essentially critical zones that have a wide zone with a shallow water table, a lot of runoff coming in there, very sensitive area in terms of nutrient management and riparian management in the watershed, probably very among the more difficult areas to farm in this watershed. Suggests that these are the areas that should have the widest riparian buffers. Other areas that have short flow paths coming in, don't have a wide zone of low-lying area. You may only need a 20 or 30-foot buffer there to help stabilize the stream bank. And you can see that a lot of this watershed has these kind of tan and yellow colors that would indicate, that you wouldn't usually need a wide buffer in some of these areas. Okay, and so that kind of runs through what we've got right now. We're still working on some things, and we are going to release a second version, and we've got a couple of new tools, and the folks in the training here are going to see our new saturated buffer tool. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information on that. We're also looking to add a tool that cites or identifies potential sites for denitrifying bioreactors. Again, that's a tile drainage edge of field practice. And then we've got a to-do list with a couple of other practices that we're hoping to get to in the next year or so. Okay. And so what's the saturated buffer? Okay, a tile drain takes water, subsurface water from this field, allowing a freely drained root zone for these crops out here, and takes that water right to the ditch or stream. The opportunity to improve water quality by having that water move through this riparian buffer is lost. And so this practice actually reconnects that tile drainage with those riparian processes. It's done with a gate structure that you put a distance from the stream and a distribution pipe. High flows are still allowed to come through. and go into the stream. But we found that in the work that's been done. Dan James in our lab has been monitoring these. There's actually there's a number of these in Illinois and Indiana and Minnesota, and the research is ongoing on this. But it's an inexpensive practice that seems very effective. So it's something that we thought we should put out there because of the importance of nitrate reduction in this region. Okay, and so you distribute this water then across that riparian zone and allow that to move through there. Okay, so what the tool we've got is asks basically 3 questions. Do we have soil conditions in this riparian zone that are conducive to the enhancement of denitrification? And can we avoid unintended consequences from installing this practice in a particular location? And the 2 types of unintended consequences are bank collapse. You know, if you increase the, bring the water table up, you can saturate that bank and have that collapse into the stream. That's not a good thing. And then also the risk of inundating this crop. And so in this tool, we map out areas in a way that helps you avoid those situations. And so just to show you how this practice, here's a shot of this practice being installed along an Iowa stream. And then the sequence we go through, we essentially use the same riparian assessment framework that we do for the riparian buffers. Look at soils criteria, bank height criteria, and then slope steepness to help identify places most conducive to that. And I'll keep I won't go into details on that right now, but folks here in the room will be seeing a lot more on this tomorrow afternoon. And so this particular watershed looks like it's got quite a few sites that might be considered for this practice. The thing is, a lot of tile drainage in this watershed, and so we'd like to see some of these go in up there. Okay, and so then we come then, kind of full circle on this. We've gone through and mapped all these practices. But I want you to kind of recognize we've just kind of gone through an analysis process. We haven't done any watershed planning at this point. We haven't made any recommendations. We don't have any recommendations. We just know, there's a large number of sites out there that are appropriate for a wide range of conservation practices. Where the selections about where these practices should actually be installed, where money should actually be spent, that's up to the landowners and the folks who work with the landowners in a planning context, who understand the particular, that particular watershed, and work with those producers, to be able to meet their needs as for agricultural production as we move towards water quality improvement. And so really, we're looking here then at the application of this, use of this in the planning process. So really what we're developing then is a menu of options. So this is all the stuff I've just shown you placed on top of each other. It's a really messy map. Okay? But if you were to break that out field by field, farm by farm, and show that to individual producers, you'd be showing them a whole bunch of different things they might be able to do in their farm. And then they'd be able to select what's most appropriate for their operation. And that's really kind of the intent of this, is to look at it as a menu. Same, just as you would in a restaurant. You don't go into a restaurant and want to sample everything on the menu. Okay? If you put all these practices, you'd overeat. If you put all these practices on the landscape, you'd be spending far more money than you would need to meet those water quality goals. And well along that track, those funds should probably go to another watershed to meet those goals as well. Okay, so then to use these in watershed planning, okay, and one of the things is I was asked is, well, how are people using this out there? And we don't have a prescription to be able to apply this information once it's developed. We are aware of that folks are using this in different ways, and that's fine. And here's just a few examples where folks have gone out directly and engaged with stakeholders. use the results to identify planning scenarios using the SWOT model. Some folks have taken the output and successfully applied for EPA 319 grants. The Housing and Urban Development provided a $94 million grant to Iowa, and the Army Corps of Engineers is involved with that. It's looking at flood prevention, and the idea here is rather than building flood walls along our cities, that maybe we should be looking at opportunities to store water up on the landscape. So the Army Corps is using a couple of these tools to map some of these opportunities out and look at the role it might be able to play at the larger basin scale. It's being used as part of the implementation of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. We've got a series, in Iowa, we've got a series of water quality initiative watersheds. There's 40 of them involved, and the state is contracting with Iowa State's GIS facility to map out sites for saturated buffers and nutrient reduction wetlands, and then we'll be providing this information to watershed planners who have been hired to work with producers in those areas. And then we've also bumped into someone we provided maps to early on in this process, and they were just paper maps, and we went out there like a year and a half later. We weren't sure, what was going on there or anything, but this NRCS DC would still have those paper maps and was using them to work with producers, and we were kind of excited about that. He was using that to cite different sorts of runoff control practices. Okay. So we've got a full menu of conservation practice opportunities. How do we combine them? So I'm going to take you through an example. And so I'm going to show you 2 watersheds, and if you want to, I'm going to try and step through this fairly quickly. This is actually described in detail in our JEQ paper that I'll give you the link to here at the end. And so we've got Beaver Creek in northern Iowa and Lime Creek over there in Illinois. And both of these are fairly heavily tile drain watersheds, but they're different types of landscapes. Beaver Creek over here is more dissected, whereas Lime Creek, there's a dissected area up in the top of the watershed, but essentially it's a very flat glacial plain out here in the lower part of the watershed. And let's see, so one of the practices that I'm going to take you back to kind of the base of the pyramid here, soil improvement. And so one of the things we think is important to consider in planning is practices like cover crops that will help improve the soils. And so when we did this analysis, we looked at several different levels of cover crop implementation. None of the fields, a third of the fields, 2/3 of the fields, and all of the fields. Okay, and these maps are not working out for some reason. Drainage water management is another one. There is an area very flat, about 50 fields down here that are appropriate, very flat and appropriate for water table control. And saturated buffers, about 25 to 30 fields that are appropriate for that. It's a good thing I have these numbers in mind, right? Because you guys can't see a darn thing here. And so, yeah, a few saturated buffers are included in some of these scenarios. And then nutrient reduction wetlands. We can intercept, we picked the lowest wetland along each tributary stream. And you can see that we've got maybe about a quarter of the watershed that can be served by these in each of these watersheds. Okay, and then so what sort of combinations of practices might you use to meet a particular reduction goal? You can come up with different combinations, but how do you actually assess it? And so what I'm going to take you through a way of thinking about this, maybe that doesn't necessarily involve the use of outside information models, and just kind of look at the information in a little bit of a different way. And I'll start that essentially by asking, well, which of these practices are most effective? Does anyone know? Well, the answer is it depends, right? So one of the things that we've been involved with the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, and they did a review of a variety of different conservation practices and looked at the nutrient reductions that occurred. And a lot of these practices are quite effective. What's the problem, though, is this number in parentheses, standard deviations of those effectiveness, very large deviations, you know. So, when I look at this, it tells me that you can't really predict which practices can be more effective than another in a given situation. So in assessing different combinations of practices, why not just assume that all the practices would have the same effectiveness? You don't know what that might be, but you know what your goal is. And so if you've got a specific distribution of practices, maybe you can just identify what that nutrient reduction you need among those practices as distributed to be able to meet that goal at the outlet. Okay? And so think about, a field with two practices. You've got a practice in the field and a practice below the field. If you've got a 50% nutrient reduction for both practices, how much is going to come out at the end, at the bottom? You can actually ask the question. Two practices, each 50%. 25%. You did that by multiplying 0.5 by 0.5. Okay? And so this approach does exactly that same thing. But it doesn't assign a number to it. It seeks a number that gives you an end result. Okay? So if you need a 40% reduction among those two practices, you can do that and run through that process and find that you need about a 26% reduction in both those practices to get a 40% reduction at the outlet. Okay? And so what we do then is calculate the average efficiency needed. We set up a spreadsheet. Each row represents a field, and then columns represent the size of the field and the presence or absence of a particular practice either within that field or below it along the flow paths that come from that field. Okay? And then you can multiply out. So if you've got a bunch of fields that have practices within them and then two practices down below, you're going to need a lot less nutrient reduction averaged among those than if you've only got one practice for each field. Okay? And you calculate that out, average nutrient removal efficiency required among the practices for a whole set of different scenarios developed from those two watersheds I just showed you, and you plot that against land taken out of production. You could use another sort of economic indicator on that y-axis, but we thought that just mapping this out as land taken out of production gives you a good idea of what the long-term costs would be from doing that. And so just to give you an idea here, the top of the scale is around 7 or 8% of the total cropland area in the watershed. And we do have combinations of practices down here that only take 2 or 3% of the watershed out of production, but have nutrient removal efficiencies that are within the range that we see in our practices. And so each of these, and here's just one example of a scenario then that plots down in this lower area. So it's worth trying. We don't know we're going to meet that goal, but we know that if we can expect those practices to function, if they do function as the literature says they might, that we have a good chance of meeting that goal. It's a reasonable start. Okay. And so folks that are here and out online there that are thinking about watershed management, how to approach this problem, they really face a dilemma. They don't have any money, or don't have enough money anyway. They don't have any authority. They can't force a solution, which I think is a good thing. It's not necessarily a problem, but it's part of the dilemma they face. And they're not quite sure of how to move forward. What's the best approach that we should take? And so I'm going to suggest that these sorts of tools can actually help in we can help spend our money more effectively, maybe. Okay? we can provide choices to landowners, get them involved with the planning process, and just understanding what that full range of options is. You know, it lets you know if you take a certain path. It lets you know what those paths are that you didn't take, and sometimes you don't even know that if you take a particular path. The other thing, you know, if you think about this last one, in 10 years from now, we need to be working on this last point right here. Okay? And you know, while I've seen a lot of use of the ACPF for watershed planning, I think there's a lot of opportunity to answer research questions as well. We do have a few grad students and faculty out of state who are starting to look at some of these issues. But here's just a sample of the kinds of questions that you might be able to, you know, the ACPF might be able to help you address. And so if you've got, you know, edge of field monitoring, how effective is a given practice in a given situation? You can get a number, but can you tell how many other fields would respond similarly? Well, with a tool like the ACPF, you could actually map that out. And then just look at the full suite of practices that are out there. If you take a particular practice, you know, and move from one landform region to the next, what's the distribution or the number of opportunities you see for the installation of that practice, and how does that vary according to landform region? But if you knew that, you might be able to budget for conservation expenditures a little bit more effectively. Okay. Stacked practices. I think this is one of the things that we're really ignoring, and one of the opportunities that we've got out there to improve the information we've got, to identify how conservation practices can work in concert together to give you a water quality improvement. That multiplication factor is probably wrong, right? We just don't know what's right, so we just pick something there. If you look at watershed models, they've gone through those same studies and taken a coefficient and stuck it in the model, right? And so it's not necessarily an improvement. If you could set up studies looking at stat practices, you would be able to do that knowing how many other opportunities, similar opportunities you've got in the watershed. And then social engagement. How do you actually go out and take this information to producers? What works best to get them involved? I think all those things are research questions that we could help address. And so I think I'm pretty close to on time here. So down to the last couple of slides, just a few summary points there. We're looking at tile drainage and runoff pathways. Soil health is very important. We stress that at the concept level and encourage folks to think about that as in a primary way. Different types of practices are cited. We've got well-known practices that are out there, but if there's other alternative practices that are out there that are still being looked at, we can, and you can come up with spatial criteria to help cite those practices. Those can be included in the toolbox. The data are becoming more widely available, and Dave's going to talk about that a little bit. But really, the most important thing to remember is we're just making suggestions with this tool. There's no recommendations that are given. It's not actually a plan. We're developing a planning resource, and if you're actually going to engage in real planning, you've got to go out there and work with your landowners. Okay, and so a few acknowledgments here. Eileen McClellan was the person who led the original Conservation Innovation Grant on this. Kathy Boomer was instrumental in some of the riparian assessment tools, mapping out those low-lying areas. She's developed some code for that. Thanks also to NRCS for their support. Rafael Guerrero and Wayne Daniels, who's here. We've been working with them with the expansion of this and the continuation, and so that support is vital to be able to offer courses like we're starting here today. And then also thanks to Rebecca Power, North Central Region Water Network for hosting the tools online. At the bottom there, I've got some links. The first three are for the papers, And then the last one there is the link for the tools and the data. And I'm not sure if we wanted to take questions right now. I guess we got to switch to the next file, and we can take questions from the group out there that's listening in. Sure.
So going to the online questions, will the new Wisconsin land use data be incorporated?
Yes, it will. I think Dave will talk about that a little bit more. Okay. The question is, will the Wisconsin input data be included soon? And that data is under development, but Dave will talk about that a little bit more. It will be included in the downloadable data next year. I think the folks who have interest in working in particular watersheds, we can provide that information probably within the next few months. But I'll defer to for more detail on that to Dave's presentation.
Next question: if Iowa is running 40 watersheds for 2 practices, why not run setup practices? Since the setup is the biggest time.
Well, why is Iowa only running 2 practices? Those are the practices they're most interested in. They will be able to run once the setup is done and the data are available, the other practices can be run very quickly. These are the ones that they're really focused on for nitrate reduction right now. That was a decision made by the State Department of Agriculture, and I was not privy to that. I did not make that decision.
What is the process of adding geographies, such as for the rest of Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio?
Dave will tell you more about that as we move through. He's got specific slides that show the process.
It seems to be dominated by dealing with drain soils and nitrates. Has it been used in a steeper landscape without tile drainage? And does it deal with phosphorus and sediment?
Yes, it can, but bear in mind that this has only been available for a year, and so the use of this to address erosion, sedimentation issues is still in the early going, and we're looking for examples where folks out there might give us experience and feedback on how to make these tools more appropriate for those settings.
How does the ACPF compare to Wisconsin DNR's eval?
We've looked at that briefly, and we've had brief discussions on that. There are some similarities. There are a couple areas where eval goes into a little bit more detail, but I think one of the discussions we might have is, converging these a little bit more, at least for Wisconsin.
And the last question: where are the ACPF tools available? And that's on the North Central Region Water Network.
Right. Yeah.
Website.
That's that last link on that last slide. That's what we've got from the field. Any other questions from in here? You guys are moving upstairs within the next hour or so. We're going to have many opportunities to ask more questions. Those of you who are only here for this morning, ask away. Okay, what we're going to do is as we set Dave up, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back in a second. We've got snacks down the hall, and we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. All right.
Good morning. Thank you. Thanks for all of you coming, and for all of you online for joining us with us. My name is David James. I'm a Geographic Information Specialist with the Agricultural Research Service. I work with Mark at the National Laboratory for Agriculture and Environment. Mark and I have been working on watershed studies for, well, close to 20 years now. And when the opportunity came along to examine how we might be able to take advantage of modern spatial data and interact with the Environmental Defense Fund and the NRCS and others, we felt it was an excellent opportunity. I'm going to speak to you briefly about the database that we've assembled for the ACPF and how it enables the tools to run. I'm also going to spend a little bit of time talking about a sister project of ours, the Daily Erosion Project, one that initiated in Iowa back in the early 2000s. But with the advent of the ACPF database, we've been able to retool that application and take advantage of the high-resolution data. So the ACPF database goals are, in essence, to provide an extensive and consistent geospatial database that allows for the development of these agricultural cooperation planning tools and to implement those at a small watershed scale, a practical scale. I like to think about it. One of the original goals that Mark and I developed was trying to enable conservation planning at the level where conservation practices are put into practice. That's the field level. We can't look at individual fields one at a time. That would be a little time consumptive. So assembling those at a watershed scale, a small watershed scale, gives us the opportunity to interact with those data at the field level, but to essentially view the information at the watershed scale. Pertinent to conservation planning are three core data sets that we use for doing our conservation planning: soils, land use, and terrain. And again, the attempt here is to develop a consistent data structure which will enable us to develop tools that will run across any of the watersheds in the database. Additionally, we've incorporated these into ESRI's File Geodatabase format. What that does is it allows people to bring their data, people that are familiar with ESRI's data products and managing data in the File Geodatabase structure. It allows them to bring their data and their tools and bring them together with the ACPF. So at this point in time, we're looking at a database that extends across 4 states, although we're actively adding additional data. Here you can see the 4 states, Iowa and Illinois, are completely filled out. Southern Minnesota, eastern Kansas. We're looking at approximately 5,000 individual watersheds that are available. Kansas will not be available until right around the 1st of October, when we plan on releasing the updated version of the database and the toolbox. That will incorporate land use information current to 2015 growing season. Somewhere around 80 million acres in agricultural land is addressed in these databases. That's out of a total of 114 million acres. I mentioned the practical scale. When we start to examine how we want to manage these data collectively, that's what my job is, and then provide them to users who are interested in addressing local conservation planning attempts. So here's Iowa. You can see the black border down the middle of the state separating the Missouri River drainage from the Mississippi River drainage. Within those there are 58 Huck 8s, 57 Huck 8s. So the dark blue lines, 390 Huck 10s. Those of you familiar with hydrologic unit codes understand these are nested watersheds that the USGS and the NRCS have developed over the years. And then for the Huck 12, the unit of implementation, if you will, there's 1,700 in Iowa alone. As we look across the landscape, again, 5,000 now are available or will be soon. We're adding additional watersheds in Wisconsin, northern Missouri, southeast Nebraska, our work with Iowa State GIS facility, and the Ag and Biosystem Engineering folks going to add the rest of Minnesota, and eventually, hopefully, flush out the rest of the areas that Mark showed earlier that we're working with with the NRCS. So I'm going to go through the evolution of the core data sets that we've developed. They're probably fundamental to all of the ACPF is accessing data at the field level. We're able to obtain the pre-2008 CLU field boundaries data set back when it was still a public data set. This formed the basis for our assembling the field data. And it was not an easy task to do. You can see here a single county's worth of data. And the data are not particularly well formed for that one single county. And that's because that FSA office will manage producers' fields regardless of where they are. That county office could find that they're managing fields hundreds of miles away in some cases. So this is a single county. Our goal here was to try and bring this into a single county. So what we did is we would assemble the counties around those, the instant county, the yellow county in this case, and we would swap back and forth the fields from the surrounding counties to capture all those satellite polygons for a particular county to try and bring them together spatially. In the end, we would find ourselves with a single county's worth of field boundaries, and we would then use that as the opportunity to enhance, update, if you will, these data to be more useful for conservation planning. We're not interested in administrative roles. We're not interested in whose land in particular that fields belong to. We only want to understand how those present opportunities for conservation planning from a landscape perspective. So with the aid of many students over a 2-year period, we took the NASS crop data layer from 2009 and those counties worth of land use data, or excuse me, the county's worth of field boundaries, and looked for those fields where land use was a single crop was not the dominant condition. So any polygon where the dominant crop was less than 75% of the field, we identified that as an opportunity to subdivide that field into a crop-specific field boundary. As you can imagine, it was a very time-consumptive process. We went through a lot of different students, and understandably so. And we were thankful for them because they could see what they were doing and we could not. In the end, we ended up with a data set where we were confident that we had captured most of the field variability in terms of specific crops for 2009. We realized that, yes, it's 2016 and those things are going to change, but, you know, from a data set that we can provide across an extensive area, being able to set the plate for future users to edit those field boundaries and make them more current to their uses, we think that we've come up with a nice set. So the land use data that we use comes from the NASS crop data layer. The Nass Crop Data Layer and Nass folks publish every year detailed satellite-derived land use information that's crop-specific. The national collection goes back to 2008. I believe Wisconsin goes back to 2006. We will assemble for our database those data going back to 2008 through 2015. We take those data, and for each polygon in a PUC-12, we'll calculate the zonal majority for the land use for each year, and the percent that that majority class makes up for that polygon. And as you can see, over the years, the Nass Crop Data Layer varies in the resolution, and if you look at the actual attribution, the number of classes varies as well. They've done a very credible job of increasing their capabilities. Now they're using Landsat 8, which is a very nice platform, and they're also using a lot of European satellites and other ones as well. So we're very pleased with the quality of the data they get, especially in recent years with regard to the land use. And so as you can see across the bottom panel here, this shows the majority crop in 2009 and the percent that makes up of that field. Then you can go all the way across, and for each year, we carry that in our crop history table. While that's very useful information, we wanted to become a little more aware of crop management practices. And so Mark and Sarah and I attempt to develop essentially a crop rotation assignment based on our different years of land use. So up above you can see for each field identified with this field boundary ID and the size, we assemble a 6-year string that represents the majority class land use for each polygon. We also summarize it in counting the number of different crops, count the number of years of continuous corn, and whether or not it was a mixed use or not. That is, whether or not the dominant crop was less than 75%. We then wrote a rule-based set of programs that examines that crop rotation string and other pieces of information here, and assign what we call a general land use. It's essentially a crop rotation string for each field. And you can see here in this map how these things fall out. Bright yellow being a strict corn and soybeans rotation, and then various levels of continuous corn added in, and so forth. We've recently modified this rather significantly when we added Kansas, and of course we started seeing a lot of wheat come into play. We had to rearrange our rule-based programs to kind of capture those land use patterns. We think that we've come up with a pretty good set. This is the land use assignment classes. So for essentially the dominant crop in that system, we have a continuous class. So continuous corn, could be continuous wheat or continuous soybeans in some cases. A perennial rotation, that would be a rotation that has a dominant crop with some permanent cover, usually some form of alfalfa or hay, that is included with that rotation, and an annual rotation. So that dominant crop with some other row crop in the mix. Then a bunch of other ones, especially that pertain to wheat, especially the wheat fallow and the corn fallow that seem to appear in Kansas quite often. wheat, soybeans, and so forth, and double crop rotations are broken out as well. We then have a pasture class, which is very inclusive. It's very difficult from a remote sensing perspective to actually identify discrete grass-based systems. And so we do a lot of lumping here: pasture grass, hay, meadow hay, alfalfa, kind of gets lumped into that structure. We also, when we find timber class with a grass class, we figure that's probably some kind of pastured woodlot, and we include that in this class as well. A mixed agriculture class that kind of is a cleanup class where we have a whole different set of things going on and we really can't figure out exactly what they're doing. One that I thought that was very interesting to me, we were able to identify those fields that somewhere in that 6-year span of time was actually classified as water. So essentially we decided to assign that a flood-prone cropland class to identify those low-lying areas that might be subject to flooding on occasion. And other classes, more non-agricultural, forest, water, urban, and the like. So that represents the mix of classes that we have within our land use data set. If we look across the 4 states, we're now looking at, again, 80+ million acres of agricultural land, 1.2 million agricultural fields. The yellow classes that are highlighted pertain to something with corn in it. We're looking at over 70% of the landscape, even with Kansas included. Over 70% of the landscape is in some kind of corn production. And notably, in this year, 400,000 acres plus of flood-prone cropland. That's down 150,000 acres from the previous 6-year period. That would have been, what, 2009 to 2014. The second component of our data structure is the soils database. We used to be called the Soil Tilth Lab. Most of the guys most of the people at our laboratory are soil scientists, soil physicists, agronomists, and the like. They're very, very keen on soils. And I've developed a number of different applications that access soils databases over the years, and it's always a little challenging because of the manner in which the soils data are managed by the NRCS. It's not a simple database, and so it takes a little bit of effort to try and assemble the data that you wish. But we take great advantage of the soils data that are available, especially the rasterized soils data, the GSERGO data that's available from the NRCS, and of course the full complement of the Soils Data Mart data structure that's available as well. Here's a simple map of a single soil property. This is taxonomic class, I believe. But here are the tables that we access when we assemble the data for the soils database in the ACPF. We have to access the full database, assemble it locally, and then write queries that extract these data as we see fit. We then parse that out to each of the individual watersheds along with the GSERGO. So this is the fields, or some of them actually, that we extract. We pull 40 fields from these variety of databases. You can see the numbers there. And because of our move towards modeling saturated buffer opportunities, we've actually made some custom extractions to understand some horizon-based information that is pertinent to saturated buffer extraction or prediction. So it's an interesting process that we go through. Since the NRCS upgrades or updates, hopefully it's upgrade, their soils database every year, this is a practice that I have to undertake at this point in time. We're trying to work with the NRCS to be able to make it so you can extract these data directly to the ACPF database without having to wait for us to perform that action. Lastly, I'll talk about the high-resolution elevation data that we use in the ACPF. We don't provide this information. Managing elevation data is a cumbersome chore. That being said, it is the linchpin to our application. Without high-resolution elevation data, we would not be able to model the landscape that we do using the ACPF tools. Mark and I used to work with the data that came from the USGS, the MED, 10-meter data, 30-meter data. You just cannot faithfully represent what's going on at the field level with that resolution of data. So then the state of Iowa acquired statewide LiDAR-derived elevation data back in 2007 to 2010 that provided us with the impetus and the opportunity to start to develop these kinds of tools and to embrace the high-resolution elevation data. But that's not without some problems that are involved, and most of those are an artifact of the fact that LiDAR is a active sensor that only records surface elevation. So every time you see a road, it takes the top of the road. It doesn't account for the fact that there's a culvert that goes under the road for the water to go through. So over the years, we've worked on developing tools and methods for what we call adaptive hydrologic enforcement. I've worked extensively with Brian Gelder at Iowa State University to develop some automated tools. More recently, we've developed tools that we can use in the ACPF to actually do the hydro enforcement of that elevation data. So a couple of different terms associated with DEM conditioning. Hydro flattening allows you, generally provided by the vendor of the elevation data, provides you with flat surfaces for water bodies. So lakes and rivers have a smooth surface. You can see here on the left in those red boxes where we have artifacts of the fact that LiDAR does not penetrate, does not return a signal from a water body, and so we'll end up interpolating from the stream banks across those. We get those typical kind of triangular facets that are associated with that interpolation process. On the right, you see those features are flattened. They present a uniform surface for the water. In the rivers, there is a gradient, so the water will flow downhill. There are no tools in the ACF for doing hydro flattening, so Jim, encourage your folks to get their data hydro flattened when they get it in Wisconsin, okay? Hydro enforcement is the enforcing of hydrologic flow across the land surface. This requires a significant amount of effort, and it is not something that comes easily. That being said, Sarah's developed a tool that allows you to edit the elevation data, if you will, and create a hydrologically enforced elevation model. When we go upstairs, that's the first thing you guys are going to be doing is figuring out how to make the water flow across the land surface. It's gotten better over the years as elevation data becomes more prevalent at these high-resolution scales that we're going to see more and more data becoming at least partially hydro-enforced, so the level of effort won't be quite as significant. So here you can see just a little indication of what the hydro-enforcement process is. You can see on the upper set of panels the elevation model in a nice symbology there. You can see the channel that's associated with the riparian area that's in the right-hand aerial photography. Without hydro-enforcement, you can see in the lower panel the shaded elevation data becomes a single color there at the southern half, and beneath that road, on the right you can see the flow paths that had to essentially fill that depression and then spill over into the riparian area on the far side. That's not acceptable from a modeling perspective. So this is a case where hydrologic enforcement would have to be conducted. As I said, Brian Giller and I have been working over the years to develop an automated process for hydrologic enforcement. This is primarily Brian's work. That he does a very credible job. It takes a little horsepower to get through it, but essentially what it does is it looks at the elevation model in this area where you see is kind of a shaded pond behind there. That's the depression where we have impeded flow. He finds, if you can see them, the little red cells that are the deepest cells in that impeded area. He then looks at a radius around that to find opportunities for flow downstream. That would be these yellow cells in this particular slide. He then identifies the best connection by looking at the range and elevation data and the proximity between the two different points, and then actively creates a vector for that line, and that line is then used to cut through those impediments to flow. In the end, you have a fully flowing elevation model. Of course, because it's automated, there's sometimes some issues with where those cuts might have gone, but they can be fixed with some of the tools we have in the ACPF. In the end, we'll have a hydrologically enforced high-resolution elevation model. In Iowa, we now have a 2-meter statewide elevation database for each HUC-12. They are partially hydro-enforced with information that came up from the Iowa DNR that in their contributions to the NHD, the National Hydrological Data Set. So that was very fortunate for us, it becomes a very, very useful data set for the ACPF. So in summary, our intent here was for our study areas to develop this extensive high-resolution database that will enable the ACPF tools to run at a field level. That's the land use, terrain, and the soils data that we've assembled. And what this does is it provides a consistent structure that allows the tools to run in any of the watersheds that are in the data structure. Mark mentioned that the North Central Regional Water Network hosts our watershed, our website. This is a map of the data, the current database, and the data that's been downloaded. It was released a year ago, essentially. And so far, we've had 650 plus watersheds downloaded. We can see in some cases significant areas. So down here in Illinois, someone took a good chunk. And then up here in Minnesota, significant amounts of watersheds. I mean, full HUC-8's worth of data have been downloaded. And, some of these have been downloaded more than once by different folks. We keep track of this as part of the download process. We have a website, the ArcGIS server application that allows you to actually download the data sans elevation data. Like I said before, we're updating the soils and land use data to include the 2015 land use and soils data. They're going to be released hopefully around the 1st of October. It'll include, eastern Kansas, and then we'll be following on with other states. Look at this slide again. Oh, I guess I don't have that slide. So we are moving on to include Wisconsin. I think we've got 23 counties of eastern or western Wisconsin that have field boundaries that have been assembled and built into the ACPS structure. After we get back in the next week or two, we'll probably run through that through the database generation process, which carves them up by HUC12, assembles all the data, then puts them into the data structure that will move over to the server for them to download. So before I go on to the daily erosion project, anybody got any questions?
Okay, so Wisconsin's the one that's are there 14
can we run the some of the ACPS with a coarser resolution elevation model? Yes, you could. In fact, some of our colleagues at the Rock Island Army Corps of Engineers have done so for the Cedar River Basin, a HUC-8 watershed in Iowa and Illinois. They did nutrient marine wetlands, and I can't remember if they were doing anything else. And they were successful in doing so. Obviously, there's going to be some issues associated with that, and trying to extract, field level information from a 10-meter DEM is going to be challenging. The tools are stable enough so that if you wanted to do something like that, you could. You can assemble, and what the guys down at Rock Island did, they assembled all the data that are required for that particular tool. It ran for about a week on their computers, but it did finish. So, and they were pleased with the results we got.
One question. I assume these ACPS database downloads don't include the hydro-condition.
So does the online database include the elevation data? No, it does not. We aren't in a position to do that. NRCS might be. Yeah. We don't have the capacity to do that. We are a research outfit, and so assembling these other data are not quite as time consumptive and compute intensive kinds of processes. So no, we do not. Any more questions? Well, he's pretty happy with it. I know that he's working with the state of Minnesota to employ it there. And he did use it on Kansas, to support our daily erosion project. I can get with me later. I'll give you his email address. You can give me a chat. As far as I understand. After a fashion, we are encouraging to take steps to publish an peer-reviewed journal article that he's got does have a publication associated with the Iowa Department of Transportation. I can get to that too. is there any opportunity to include the Gelder's hydro enforcement tool in the ACPF? Not at this time. We haven't really talked about that opportunity yet. I suspect that he might be amenable to something like that. I mean, we work with him every day, so try to say.
Modify that in order to provide.
So Teresa Nelson from the Wisconsin DNR has shared with us that Gelder has shared with them the source code for the hydrologic enforcement process, and they're working on trying to get that to function fully. All right, I'm going to move along to again, a sister project, if you will, the Daily Erosion Project that is an effort that has been ongoing since the early 2000s. You can see here the cast of thousands that have been involved with this over the years. Rick Cruz is the head of the Iowa Water Center. He is the project lead for this. Brian Gelder, Daryl Hersman, also with Iowa State Ag and Biosystems Engineering and the Agronomy Department, respectively, and then again a significant number of other folks. Soil loss is a critical topic when it comes to agriculture and other types of activities on the landscape. Mark stressed how important the soil resource is to agriculture and how maintaining the quality of the soil is something that we would like to see. Certainly the more soil you can keep on the ground, the healthier soil is going to be. So soil loss is a critical issue, especially given growing population and food demands. We find that understanding soil loss is an important issue. Our effort here with the soil erosion, or Daily Erosion Project, is one for informational needs, trying to inform folks as to the magnitude and the distribution of soil loss across the landscape. And we want to be able to characterize these soil erosion impacts and basically increase their recognition with regard to food production and the public cost of soil loss. We employ the WEP model, the Water Erosion Prediction Program, developed by the ARS. John Laughlin, Dennis Flanagan from Purdue Soil Erosion Laboratory, Jim Frankenberger are the keepers of that particular program. It uses rainfall, and elevation surface, land use, and soils to understand how rainfall events interact with the landscape, infiltration and soil runoff. And we felt that when we had begun using the ACPF database with its high resolution data, it basically gave us an opportunity to enhance the Daily Erosion Project with these new data. So again, this is the same or similar image as before. What we are looking for is an opportunity to identify soil loss, and we needed a sampling framework and a reporting framework. We chose the Huckett watersheds, the same framework that we use for the ACPF to allow us to run our watershed erosion prediction. And so again, in Iowa right now is 1,700 watersheds, and we're expanding our efforts to become more regional. Oh, these aren't going to work. These are the cool, push the button, have different things come up. Man. In any event, let me see if I can go through this. So these nested frames here. Back behind here is a Huck 12 watershed. If we look interior to that, we can start to see subcatchments within that Huck 12 watershed. And then within each subcatchment, we run some fairly sophisticated software developed by David Carbotton, Utah State University, to identify these subcatchments. And then what we do is identify a individual flow path at random that is in each subcatchment. So we shoot for somewhere around 150 subcatchments per Huck 12 watershed, and then run each of those as a sample. Let's see what we got here. So this is a representation of our flow paths. Subcatchments are in the darker blue. The pale blue is the actual stream channel. So for each flow path, it's going to terminate either at a stream feature or a non-agricultural land use feature, or in this case, you can see here, this little pink dot, that's a depression. So each one of these is going to have a portion that's appropriate for modeling using WEP. WEP is a sheet and wheel loss model, and so you can't model the entire piece of that, and so we subset our flow paths to represent only those portions of the flow path that would be susceptible to sheet and wheel loss and modeling with traditional soil loss models. So currently we're modeling 1,800 watersheds at all of Iowa and a portion of Minnesota. Again, we're moving forward to include Minnesota in all of Minnesota eventually, and eastern Kansas and other states that are interested. That's 222 some odd flow paths that are modeled every day for soil loss. This seems to be so cool. So you're going to have to kind of squint here. The slender black lines are just flow paths, right? There's every cell in a catchment is going to flow downhill. So this is a subset of those. Then I would push the button, of course, and it would show you the yellow and then the thick black lines that would represent the one flow path that we are modeling for this particular subcatchment. We then take those flow paths, we drop them on top of the soils database that we assembled for the ACPF and the land use data. And then for each flow path, where it breaks at land use or soils boundaries, we create a overland flow element. Soil loss is actually calculated by these OFEs and then assembled for that singular flow path. So if we look at soil loss across the years, we can see that it varies spatially, temporally, and we can estimate an average for the state. You can see that we estimate it in milligrams per hectare. We also do that in terms of tons per acre. Those of you familiar with soil erosion and nomenclature might recognize tons per acre and equate that to a t-value, or that's the suggested tolerable soil loss that is allowed to preclude soil degradation. Maximum T, maximum allowable soil loss for any soil in the United States, is 5 tons per acre. So you can see here in 2007, we estimated across the state 2.8, but every time you look at that 2 colors of red, we're over 50 tons per acre of soil loss, estimated just from sheet and wheel loss by the WEP model for each of these Huck 12s. And in 2008 and 2010, we're well over 5 tons per acre. And you can see here 4 more years. 2012, a very dry year. Soil loss across the state, less than 2 tons per acre. 2014, a fairly wet year. Soil loss greater than 5 tons per acre across the state. Long-term average, 5.7 tons per acre per year across the state for the 7-year period, which means, of course, that at approximately 1 millimeter for 5.7 tons per acre, we're losing a lot of soil every single year. So, again, the intent of the Daily Erosion Project to inform the public and interested folks in terms of the magnitude of soil loss across the agricultural landscape is our goal. If you look at the Natural Resources Inventory, which does have an estimate of soil loss going back into the 80s, and then compare that with, in the green here, our most recent Daily Erosion Project estimates, you can see the variability that we suggest. As a mean, we're pretty much right in line with the NRI. I don't know if that's good or bad. Then we have a colleague of ours, Soren Rundquist from Environmental Working Group, who took the data from our Daily Erosion Project for each HUC 12 over a 5-year period, assembled it by HUC 8, and then correlated that with the soils database estimates of highly erodible land. As you can see, the amount of soil loss estimated and the number of acres of highly erodible land are highly correlated. R squared is about 0.85. I think everybody would be happy with. So we understand where the problems might be. We understand where the highly erodible lands are. And therefore, we can use that information, now again with the ability to examine at the HUC 12 level. There might be opportunities from a regional perspective where the ACPF toolbox might be appropriate to examine opportunities for interrupting soil loss. In the future, we want to incorporate a sediment phosphorus transport function into the GEP, address the ephemeral gully erosion, which is a significant piece and very dynamic every year, channel transport and mass wasting along the stream banks, soil moisture estimates, and then some folks in our group want to try and move down to the field level estimates of running our model, which I think is going to be a real challenge. But it's a lofty goal. So we've seen this before. This is our ACPF and Daily Erosion Project expansion goals. The dark green are the counties that are currently in the Daily Erosion Project. Those that are opportunities simply need to have someone to mass produce the elevation data so that we can incorporate it into the model. That's all it's going to take. It's going to be a good effort. Like I said, Brian Gelder has been working with Kansas and is again working with Minnesota to extend the Daily Erosion Project to include those portions of the landscape. You can see down here along the northern tier of Missouri and southeast east of Nebraska, there's ACPF database has been generated, SANS elevation data, so there's an opportunity there. Illinois, Tim, when they get statewide elevation data, we'll be able to bring that there. And again, these are the 23 counties in Wisconsin that we're in the process of generating the ACPF for. Future plans include the remainder of Minnesota agricultural areas, possibly North Dakota as well, and the western Lake Erie Basin. I have to acknowledge all these folks Without them, the Daily Erosion Project would have never evolved to the point where it is. Our team, of course, the Nutrient Reduction Center, or Nutrient Research Center now, and a whole host of different folks that are involved with development of this thing. So now I'm going to try to access the website. This is just how well it works, and see if we can come up with kind of show you the access point and give you an idea of. So any questions about the Daily Erosion Project? I'll try to go down. That's a good question. To what extent does the Daily Erosion Project account for infield practices? We use high-resolution elevation data as the foundation for this to develop our flow paths. And one of the moves that originally we developed a 3-meter elevation model for Iowa that we used. We've recently gone back and rebuilt it to a 2-meter elevation database to do a better job of capturing things like terraces and ponds and so on and so forth, so that if we do have a flow path that initiates above a terrace, it'll stop at the terrace. We realize that we need to account for these things, and so the higher quality DEM that you have, the better off you're going to be at capturing. So here is the website for the Daily Erosion Project. And you can see for August 22nd, now, it was a beautiful day in Iowa yesterday. And so what we're going to do is go to the interactive site, I hope. And again, we see very little rainfall anywhere in the Midwest. Here's our framework. What we can do is roll down here, and here's our date tags. We can start marching backwards. And here we can see on the 20th of August, the distribution of rainfall across Iowa and southeast Minnesota. The highest value, somewhere down here in the southeast, is 1.92 inches of rain. We can look at runoff, how much runoff was produced by those events on average across those watersheds. How much soil was detached, and then how much soil was delivered. So maximum value 0.47, that's in tons per acre per year, or tons per acre. That would be tons per acre per day. So on that day, 0.47 tons per acre were delivered in those watersheds, estimated. Do them all. One of the interesting things we can do is, let's see if we can do this. We zoom in, and it will show you put a little tag, how much is estimated there for each watershed. We can also touch a watershed, and you can see here are the top 10 events for that particular watershed. We can look at the yearly estimates of soil loss, precipitation, runoff, detachment, and delivery for that watershed across the years, and a graph that represents by month estimated soil loss for that watershed. So let's move back to a broader scale. We can also include multiple dates. So let's go back to June, so June 1st. So we go back into the database and extract for the state of Iowa, or for the entire project area, our estimates of soil loss And in this case, the highest one, 27.93 tons per acre over that growing season for this year. Let's see. How about 3 years? The tool allows us to interact with the data structure. This is the magic that Carol Hersman at Agronomy demonstrates. Here we're looking at a maximum of 142 tons per acre. Divide that by 5, that's 100 millimeters. We're starting to talk about a significant amount of land. Now, it's spatially distributed, right? The less hills, very steep, highly erodible. Oh my goodness.
It's okay. Our participants online are not seeing what you're seeing, so.
That's too bad.
Yeah.
We're probably left by now.
No, they're still there.
So as you can see, the Bailey Road project provides us an opportunity to examine the extent and magnitude of strong loss based on the WEP model, includes current land use, soils, and elevation data. And hopefully this will allow for that discussion about soil health, soil resource, conservation planning, kind of bubble up to the top or slide downhill. So, any questions about the Bailey Road project?
An online question, are you using D-Infinity to develop the overland flow plan?
The question is, are we using D-Infinity to identify the flow paths? The answer is, the first answer is no. For those of you that don't know, D-Infinity is a flow direction, flow accumulation method developed by David Tarbot in the late 90s, which allows for a dispersive flow. And I think I would believe that does a better job of representing flow across the landscape. That being said, it's not necessarily an easy way, an easy thing to use, right? So Sarah and I have just recently developed some opportunities to use the terrain parameters that are estimated using the D-Infinity flow process. We hope to use others, but no, not in the Bailey Road.
Another question, are any of the climate-based crop management vendors coming for finance that are working with the island and
Are any of the crop management consultants and what do you call them? Decision support folks, Climate Corps, Monsanto. There's a lot of the big ag business are starting to provide access to high resolution data. Not to my knowledge, we have not engaged with those. Although that being said, Rick Cruz was just last week or so down talking to Monsanto and probably demonstrating the Bailey Road project.
and Rick is on, but chat. How does Green County, Wisconsin get added on the map later?
I'm not sure where Green County is, but it's going to take an effort to first of all build up the HCPF database. Is Green County where we're going? You know? Okay. A lot depends on you know, how much interest there is in the ACPF and subsequently processing the elevation data that will allow for inclusion of the daily erosion project. I know that Rick Cruz and Brian Gelder are actively seeking collaborators, Rick would like to see the daily erosion project become essentially a regional soil loss estimation center. So I'm sure that they would love to talk to whomever they can. Okay. Anything else? Only slightly over. First of all, I'd like to thank the online participants and joining us. Wait. Oh, okay. They haven't seen that. So let me. Okay.
How is the sample flow now with less estimate you are using your patients using
We know staff, and Russell 2, like WEP, is generally speaking a one-dimensional soil loss model, like the USLE, like Russell, like all of the one-dimensional soil loss models. The more sophisticated ones, like Russell 2 and WEP, incorporate crop growth models, soil moisture models, and so forth. That's a question that we've asked one of Rick's graduate students to pursue, is what would happen, what kind of differences would we see if we ran Russell 2 as opposed to WEP as part of our soil loss estimate? That's a good question. We need a graduate student. Everybody got a graduate student we could use. So we have that question in mind. We work with Seth Dabney quite a bit, and I know that we're all kind of pursuing the same understanding of soil loss. So Russell 2 has evolved quite a bit to include a crop growth model. I don't know if they do soil moisture. I suspect so to some level. I know that Seth has been working with some guys from the University of Tennessee to do thermal gully modeling and incorporate that into soil loss estimates, as are we. And so, we all are kind of going after the same thing. I guess we'll see who gets it first. Trying to benchmark the soil loss estimates is a challenge. The thing that WEP does have going forward is back in the 80s and 90s when it was developed, John Laughlin and the Soil Erosion Laboratory did extensive amounts of benchmarking to make sure that the estimates that they were producing are valid. Obviously, trying to do that against 200,000 estimates on a daily basis is a little different animal. So it's hard to get the same. So for those of you that are online and didn't get a chance to see the Daily Erosion Project, this is the website that's available at dailyerosionproject.org or dailyerosion.org. We can.
Before you go through that, the folks who are going to be heading upstairs, who are very important, well, you see them already, take a break and head upstairs.
Yeah, top of the stairs and then to the right. So I'll carry on for the folks online. The Daily Erosion Project estimates on a daily basis the soil loss. As you can see here, August 22nd, there was no rainfall in the area, so no soil loss. As we move backwards in time, we can get back here to, in this case, August 20th. We can see a significant amount of rainfall. Upwards of 2 inches in southeast Iowa, and over half an inch in parts of Minnesota. The web application has different tabs so that you can examine different portions of the soil loss puzzle. So there's precipitation, there's runoff in terms of inches, detachment in tons per acre. And let me zoom in here. If we zoom in far enough, we'll see each individual watershed's estimate for, in this case, detachment, and then delivery. So that we can see here 0.3 tons per acre on average across this particular watershed. If I click on that watershed, it will give me not only the estimate for the 20th of August, it also gives me the top 10 events for that particular watershed, allows me to examine annual estimates of soil loss from 2007 to 2014, 15, 16, and it does so for each of the different components for soil loss, as precipitation, runoff, detachment, and delivery. Additionally, it provides a summary for that watershed by month for, in this case, soil detachment. So it allows us to characterize just what's going on, when and where soil loss components kind of manifest themselves. We zoom out a little bit here. Additionally, we can examine a period of time instead of just a single date. So here we can go back to, let's go back to the 1st of August. It will access the database and show us that across Iowa and southeast Minnesota, we have upwards of 8 tons per acre of soil loss. For the month of August, we go back to June and look at June, July, and August. We can see that we have upwards of 28 tons per acre lost. Clearly, we can see there are certain areas within the state that experience more soil loss than others, notably the steeply highly dissected Luss Hills in western Iowa, and some of the driftless areas and more dissected pieces of Iowa and Minnesota along the Mississippi River. So again, we can zoom in closely. You can see over that period of time, basically the growing season thus far this year, 15, 16 tons per acre per year lost in individual watersheds. And as we move over towards Des Moines load, much less relief, less than a ton per acre per year. Since you all can't talk to me, it's kind of hard to know when to stop. If you have questions, type them into the comment window, and we'll try to address them. Other than that, please visit the Daily Erosion Project website and see for yourself how useful this tool is. To the best of my knowledge, we have not pursued that. Again, you know, these one-dimensional soil loss models are for sheet and rill loss. Therefore, we don't try and estimate sediment delivery to the stream or even the ephemeral gully. Our sediment delivery estimated here is to the end of the flow path for sheet and rill loss. So essentially down the hill, not the purview of WEP to do anything beyond that. That's certainly a research topic that most soil loss modelers are trying to address. So it's just me and Rebecca and Janice here. So we're going to sign off. If you do have any questions, follow on, contact us at the National Laboratory for Ag and the Environment, and we'll be happy to see what we can do to address your issues.